Thank you so much, and especially Rhoda, thank you so much. Rhoda brought me down here, I guess it would have been 4 years ago, 2015. Yeah. And she has been an inspiration in building this organization. I think that what America needs, to counterbalance the crazy, which is our culture of politics right now, is a focused practice, a discipline, a religion of learning how to talk across partisan lines about important issues that affect the whole nation. And this program here in New Jersey is inspiration. I'm so happy to be back. So I want to start by saying you know something that's true, something that is true. You're here. We're all here because you know something that is true. You know we live in the greatest democracy that never was, promised to us by the oldest living written constitution that there ever was, and yet still to this day that promise has not been performed. And my view is it is time that it be performed, because we cannot wait any longer for that promise to be real. It has been more than 20 years since a clear majority of Americans were convinced that climate change was real and that we were responsible, and yet Congress has not passed a single piece of comprehensive legislation to address climate change. The healthcare system in America is one of the most expensive in the world, with 25% of the amount we spent on the administrative budget, and still 12% of Americans uninsured. And yet all our Congress can talk about is whether or not we will continue to guarantee insurance for those with pre-existing conditions. Infrastructure in America is said to have been graded a D by the American engineering experts. They say that we have to spend $1.5 trillion in the next 5 years to make America safe again. But the closest that our Congress can come to the number 1.5 trillion is $1.6 trillion in tax cuts to the richest Americans and corporations that will not have any effect, it has not had any effect in driving an economic recovery. Now, my view is this is not caused by one man. This problem is not due to the president. The problem is a system that does not represent us. Now, you can say that's a system compromised. That's the emphasis of my book that was published last year, America Compromised. You can say it's the product of a system that does not represent us. That's the theme of my book that's coming out in a month. You should pre-order your copies right now. We could pause if you want to do that. Either way of seeing this, the argument I want you to see tonight is that to solve these problems, these fundamental problems of America's democracy, we have to fix it. We have to fix this system, and we have to convince the politicians that it needs to be fixed first. These problems are the most important problems. You pick which you care about most, whether it's climate change or healthcare or the future of our economy or infrastructure. I don't care. Whatever problem you think is the most important problem, that's the most important problem. But my problem, this problem, is the first problem. If we don't fix this problem, none of those other problems will ever be addressed sensibly. Okay, so how? How do we do it? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to see the source of the problem. We have to understand why we have the inability of our government now to function. And that source, I want to say, is a certain kind of inequality. I don't mean racial inequality, I don't mean sex inequality, I don't mean economic inequality. What I mean is political inequality. Henry David Thoreau wrote, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the roots." I want to say that this is the root. Though I spent many years saying money in politics was the root, I've discovered an even deeper root. It's not that money in politics is not important, it is critically important. But money in politics is just one example of many examples of a system that renders us unequal as citizens. And it's that inequality of citizens that makes it so our democracy does not function. The framers of our Constitution gave us what they called a republic. And by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. Now, the idea behind a representative democracy is that the system is representative. It's kind of built into the word, right? Representative democracy means we are represented equally. Yet our system is unrepresentative because of the many ways in which it renders us unequal as citizens. So think about a couple dimensions of that. Do we as citizens have an equal freedom to vote? The answer is we have no equal freedom to vote because states administer voting systems to make it harder for the party that just doesn't happen to be in power. That typically is African Americans in states that have Republican administrations because African Americans vote primarily Democratic, but you don't have to see it as racism. It's just politics. But what that means is that those who are in the party out of power find it harder because of rules designed to make it harder for them to vote, or inequalities in access to voting machines or the capacity to vote. That inequality suppresses the vote of many. Charles Stewart at MIT estimates in the last election, 16 million Americans found their vote suppressed because of this inequality. Or do we have an equal freedom to vote for president? We do not. Not so much because of the Electoral College, more importantly because of a system called winner take all, built into the Electoral College. All but 2 states allocate all of their Electoral College votes to the winner of the popular vote. So if you win the plurality by even 5 votes, by even 1 vote, you get all of the Electoral College votes in that state. But what that means is that this is not the country that picks America, that picks our president. This is the country that picks our president. This country. This country is the country made up of these so-called swing states. Because if you're a candidate running for president, it makes no sense to campaign anywhere except in this country, the country of swing states. In 2016, 95% of campaign appearances were in these states, 99% of campaign spending. The only time candidates went out of these states is when they went to New York or to California to raise money. This is the country that picks our president. These are the swing states. Let's call them the swingers in America. But here's the thing. The swingers don't represent America. They're older, they're whiter. Their industry is a kind of 19th century, early 20th century industry. There are 7.5 times the number of people in America working in solar energy as mine coal. But you don't hear of solar energy in presidential elections because those people come from Texas and California. You hear about coal miners because coal miners are in these swing states. So what that means is, if you don't come from a swing state, your vote doesn't matter. And even if you do come from a swing state, if you happen to vote for the minority, your vote will not even be registered because all of the Electoral College votes will go to the person who won the majority. So that means in the last election, 85 million people went to the polls to have their vote just not matter in the selection of the president. Or do we have an equal vote in the House of Representatives? And the answer is obviously no, because of gerrymandering. States work hard to draw their districts. I know New Jersey has had a recent fight about whether this would be true or not, and I was very excited to see the extraordinary citizens movement in New Jersey that stopped partisan gerrymandering in New Jersey. But most states draw their districts to produce safe seats so that they can guarantee which party will win in a particular district. And they draw these districts in this extraordinarily creative way. Christopher Ingraham calls these crimes against geography. As you draw the district to guarantee it will produce the result that you want it to produce. But the thing about safe seats is that though they guarantee which party will win, what they also do is mean that the only politicians who can challenge the incumbent are politicians who are even more extreme than the incumbent. So if you're a safe seat Republican congressperson, what you're fearful of is an even more extreme right-wing Republican challenger, because it's the base which is typically polarized to the extreme that's going to show up in the primary. Or if you're a safe seat liberal Democrat, what you're worried about is an even more liberal Democrat who will show up and challenge you, because you know that the base in the Democratic primary will be the most liberal base. So what that means is Congress people are constantly looking to the extremes, because they are constantly fearful that the extremes will challenge them, which produces a system that empowers the extremes relative to the rest of those who would vote, which is why Congress right now is polarized far more than America is polarized. That's a product of the system of gerrymandering. And if you add up those whose votes therefore don't matter, it's about 89 million Americans on this dimension who don't have an equal place in our democracy. Or the most extreme, the most grotesque, the most obvious of inequalities is the inequality in the way we fund campaigns. We take it for granted in America that congressional campaigns will be privately funded. And what that means is that candidates for Congress and members of Congress spend their time raising money. Now you think, how much time do they spend raising money? The answer is they spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money. 30 to 70% of their time dialing for dollars, calling people up. Today when I talked to the kids, they weren't quite sure what this technology was, but seemed to be familiar. But the point is they're calling up these people, sucking up to people with power to raise the money they need to get their party back into power, to themselves back into the office. Now, when they're calling for half their time, they're not calling the average American. They're calling about 120,000 Americans who are the Americans who give enough to be worth their time to call. Those 120,000 Americans then have enormous power relative to the people who are not called. And as they do this, as members of Congress do this, it affects them. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is a picture of the life of a congressperson right now, as they learn through this process which buttons they need to push to get the sustenance they need to survive. It has an effect on them. They develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money. Not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So this dynamic means some people have enormous power, the funders, and the rest of us don't, which means about 139.5 million Americans have less power because of this feature of our system, while a tiny fraction don't. And if we had to make this actually proportionate, we'd have to cut off 4/5 of the head of this person to make the numbers actually fit the graph. Okay, so add all these together, and it's pretty obvious what the consequence is. They don't represent us. In each of these dimensions, they don't represent us. It's not just the money. It's the extremism because of partisanship. It's not just the partisanship. It's the inequality and suppression of vote because of the way administrators make it harder for the other party to vote. It's not just the suppression of vote. It's also the fact the president Doesn't care about America. The president cares about that weird country that I showed you by linking together the swing states. Add these all together. They don't represent us. And it's not just a theory, it's a reality. There's a Princeton study. As a Harvard professor, I like to get that off the stage as quickly as I can. Martin Gillens and Ben Page did the largest empirical study of the actual decisions of our governments in the history of political science, relating those actual decisions of our government over the last 40 years to the attitudes of the economic elite, presumptively funders of campaigns, the attitudes of organized interest groups, and the attitudes of the average voter. What they found with the economic elite is what you'd expect. As the percentage of the elites support something, the probability that that thing had been passed went up. That's the way you'd expect it. The more who support it, the more likely it is to be passed. So 0% supported, about 0% it's going to be passed. 100% supported, about a 36% chance that it was passed. These are actual decisions our government made. Here's organized interest groups. Same dynamic. The more who support it, the more likely it is to have been passed. It's the way democracy is supposed to work. Here's the average citizen. That's a flat line, literally and figuratively. What this is saying is it doesn't matter the percentage of average citizens who support something. It doesn't change the probability of that thing having been enacted. As they put it in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. In a democracy, the average citizen's views do not matter to the actual decisions our government has taken. Right? This is the kind of naive image I think we all had about democracy in America. There we are, we the citizens, kind of middle of America, driving the bus. Here's the reality. The steering wheel has become removed because the system has been allowed to render us so radically unequal that a very few with power steer the bus, even if it promises that we are the ones steering. Here is the core idea. This promise of a representative democracy has been compromised by this inequality. And that compromise means that the system cannot function to produce a democracy that gives most citizens what most citizens believe their democracy should do. Okay, now, the great hope here is that we get it. It's not a surprise to anyone. Middle of the last presidential election in July of 2016, University of Maryland did this extraordinary study to measure attitudes about government among voters, in particular extreme Trump supporters and extreme Clinton supporters. And they found the largest measured anger about government in the history of polling. Americans are more angry, more frustrated with their government than they'd ever been. But when they asked them why, the striking fact was there was no difference between Republicans and Democrats about why. So, corporations and their lobbyists have too much influence. 89% of all voters believe that, 89% of Republicans, 90% of Democrats. Elected officials think more about the interests of their donors than the common good, 89% of voters, 92% of Republicans, 88% of Democrats. Big campaign donors have too much influence. 91% of voters, 90% of Republicans, 91% of Democrats. This extraordinary fact that in this world where we think we are all so divided and America is teetering in this division, the fact is we are united about the fact that our government is not functioning and united about why. We all believe it is this corruption of the political system that is making it so our government cannot function. We believe something that is true. What is true is believed. It is believed by all. It is the greatest political resource for leveraging the opportunity to actually fix this problem that there is in our political system. So you would think then that everyone who is or had been thinking about running for president, and there's a large list of those people, would be talking about this. You'd think that this fact that we are all in agreement about this problem and the source of the problem and the solution for the problem would mean this would be the kumbaya we could finally find and sing together. But no, it's not working like that. There are, of course, many politicians who check the box of reform, tell us they believe in reform, and then practically every one of them speaks the language of fantasy politics. They talk about the beautiful things, as if we had a democracy already. They talk about single-payer health care or higher minimum wage, the Green New Deal, free college, as if winning is enough, as if getting more votes means getting what you want, as if the promise of this democracy had already been performed, as if the system were not rigged. But we should know better here. You can't promise these fantasies without fixing the system first. Or if you speak the language of fantasy without talking about fixing the system, then you are just not serious. You're playing a game of politics to get elected. You're not playing the game to govern America in a way that will solve the problems of America. You're just not serious unless you commit to fixing this first. I am so proud that my friend John Sarbanes, who's a congressman from Maryland, convinced the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, at the beginning of 2019, to introduce as H.R. 1 the most important and ambitious reform package that has been passed by the House of Representatives since the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This bill would address 85% of the problems that I've described in the inequality of our political system. It would radically change the way political campaigns for congresspeople were funded. No longer would they be dependent on raising money from the tiny, tiny few. They'd have an extraordinary opportunity to raise money in small contributions that would be matched, and it even had a pilot program to giving voters vouchers, which they could use to help fund political campaigns. Changing the business model of campaign fundraising, so the candidates are not focused on the tiny few, but they are focused on many. It had a provision to insist, because the Constitution gives Congress this power, that states do not gerrymander politically, at least when drawing congressional districts. It was a commitment to restoring the Voting Rights Act, an extraordinary mistake of the Supreme Court, withdrawing the incredible protections that guaranteed equal access to the ballot in the South. And it had an amazingly ambitious anti-revolving door provision that made it increasingly difficult for politicians and bureaucrats to do the business of Washington, which is to constantly spin between government and private business, always increasing their salary as they do so. This was an extraordinary bill, which of course, once it passed in the House, died on the floor of the Senate, as Mitch McConnell, the Dark Lord, declared that it was nothing more than a partisan game. It was a Democratic power grab. Now, I think this is a Democratic power grab in the small d sense of democratic. It is a power grab to restore democracy. It's not a power grab for large D Democrats. It's a power grab to make sure that when we as citizens step up, we step up equally in this political system. So it was important not just because it was right, but the really incredibly important fact about H.R. 1 was that it was H.R. 1. What that said was, because it was first, it revealed that even Nancy Pelosi acknowledges the priority here, acknowledged the necessity of addressing this problem if anything else was possible. It was a way of them saying nothing else would be possible until we address this first. Nothing else was possible before this. Now, I think H.R. 1 should be an inspiration for us. I think we should take it and we should say, well, what about POTUS 1? If H.R. 1 was a commitment to fundamental reform and first, we should get every candidate to make an equivalent POTUS 1 commitment. We should get every candidate to answer, what is it that you promised to do on day one? How will you make that happen? And are you courageous enough to utter words which politicians somehow find it impossible to utter? Are you courageous enough to say we need public funding for public campaigns? Now, if they're not willing to say those things together, I will make a commitment of fundamental reform on day one that includes this critical element. If they don't do this, then I think we must say they are just not serious. We have to measure them against this standard set by the president, who will best drain the swamp. And we need to do this work now, because if it's not now, America will miss it. This is the one thing that unites us, but it seems increasingly to be an afterthought for them. An afterthought is not enough. It has to be the first thought. It has to be the first thing out of their mouth, because nothing else is possible unless this is done, and they need to convince us that they get this, that nothing else is possible unless this thing is done. So will they? Well, there's good news here, and there's bad news here. Let's start with the good news. The fact is, over the last 6 months, many of them have. My organization, Equal Citizens, runs a POTUS 1 project where we're doing podcasts and town halls with as many candidates as we can. These 9 have so far made the POTUS 1 commitment. Their POTUS 1 commitment is fundamental reform on day one, and their fundamental reform is, from our measuring, substantial enough to have a substantial effect on the problem that I started with. Represent Us has a similar project, the Fix Democracy First project, where they have gotten these candidates to make a commitment that they will fix democracy first. So the point is, many different organizations have found this focus and are beginning to get the commitment from them that indeed their first move will be a move to address the democracy problem. But we've not yet seen this as first in what they present themselves as fighting for. So why is that? And this is where we get to the bad news. The bad news is, first, the media won't talk about this. What's striking is not a single question asked in any of the Democratic debates so far has been a question about democracy reform. Not a single media interrogator here has thought it important to address the one thing we have to do to make any of the other things even sensible. They don't think democracy reform is even an issue, so they don't ask the candidates about democracy reform. So at the end of a debate, you don't hear candidates talking about democracy reform because it's just not within the frame of what the media want to talk about. And it's not yet in the frame of what the candidates believe they have to talk about first. And the reason for this is that the experts in the political system, those people who said that, for example, Donald Trump could never be elected president, those people say that we don't care about this issue. Those people say it's too complicated. I had one of these consultants explain it to me in some impatience. He said, they're too stupid, talking about the people. They don't give about the process. So because they believe this fact of reform doesn't sell, what instead they do is sell snake oil to win an election. They go around and telling us all the pretty things they're going to give us, as if Santa Claus were on the stage. when they all know that none of it is possible until they address what they all know is this corrupted and broken political system. So to win a nation, to win a campaign, they're willing to lose a nation. So it's a question, a genuine question. Can we be convinced as a people to care about democracy first, to put aside differences that we might have as Republicans and Democrats and focused here first? It's a real question. There's reasons to be hopeful. In 2018, for example, we had the largest number of democracy reforms passed in the states, in grassroots referenda, ever in the history of the nation. Overwhelming frustration bubbling up in the states to attack the status quo because they have a mechanism through the referendum process to express themselves, and when they do it, it taps into an unseen energy in American citizens. In Michigan, a 20-something-year-old woman named Katie Fahey put a Facebook post up. Said 2 days after the election, anybody want to work on gerrymandering? Within 2 months, there were 4,000 volunteers in Michigan who were going across the state to collect more than 400,000 signatures to get their petition on the ballot. And they raised, through tens of thousands of contributors, millions of dollars to fight this in television ads against an extraordinary amount of money against democracy reform. And the thing Katie Fahey told me about that fight is that there was a religion to that fight. And the first principle of that religion was, never could you talk about this as a Democratic issue or as a Republican issue. It was a citizen issue. It was not about how to make the Democrats more competitive or to make sure the Republicans had a shot. It was how to give people a sense that their political system was fair and honest in its promise to deliver democracy to the people. That energy produced unbelievable number of people willing to spend countless hours to do something no one thought was possible. And when they won with more than 61% of the vote in Michigan, they won because Democrats and Republicans and independents all believed a fair system was worth fighting for. That energy is out there. And the only question is, how do we tap it nationally? Is it possible to tap it in a presidential campaign? That's a yes or no question. And when I ask that question, and I see among the, quote, experts the resistance, I feel like I find myself in a place that has been the place I have always been throughout my career. So 20 years ago, this man, John Perry Barlow, who was an extraordinary poet, he used to write for the Grateful Dead, convinced me to write my first book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, which is about the nature of the internet. Barlow said, the internet guaranteed its freedom. It's a guaranteed space of free speech and privacy and innovation and opportunity. And what I said in this book is, John Perry, you're missing something important. The nature of the internet can be flipped. Because the internet is just an architecture, it's a technical architecture, and that architecture could change. And I said it would be changed. And in this book I said the governments and business would work together to change the very nature of the internet from a place that protected free speech and privacy and the opportunity to innovate to a space that would be much harder to speak freely, much less privacy, and much more control over the opportunity to innovate. New York Times didn't like this review, this book. David Pogue wrote, somewhat tepid review. He said, Lessig plays digital Cassandra. He predicts the internet will become a monster that tracks our every move, but that nobody will heed his warning. These discussions are thoughtful and measured, but the premise that frames them all is shaky. Lessig doesn't offer much proof that a Soviet-style loss of privacy and freedom is on its way. Unlike actual law, internet software has no capacity to punish. It doesn't affect people who aren't online. Only a tiny minority of the world's population is. And if you don't like the internet system, you can always flip off the modem. Now, I never knew exactly what he meant by maybe that's the flip off. But what I want to do is to embrace the Cassandra claim here. I'll take that Cassandra claim. Because I feel like I've played this Cassandra role repeatedly, a number of times. So 15 years ago, when Disney and others were so terrified about the internet and what it was doing with copyright, I wrote 2 books that said the thing we should fear is overreaction here. Because I thought that the fear was overblown and extreme, and if we reacted to it by building the technology to perfectly control what anybody can do on the internet, then we would radically suppress the opportunity of people to be creators and the opportunity of them to share their creativity. Now, we've built the system of tracking into the internet. If you upload something to YouTube, within 30 minutes, it has been scanned by a technology to determine whether there's any so-called copyrighted music in the video. And if there is, it will either take the video down, or it will turn off ads for the video, or it will tell you that you've committed copyright violations, and if you do it 3 times, you get kicked off of YouTube. So there are many creators out there who create and find themselves turned off because the system interprets their stuff as violating copyright. Here's one really compelling story by a guy who teaches people how to play guitar through his YouTube channel. So he does guitar lessons, and of course to teach people to play guitar, you got to play a couple riffs to show them what to do, and this is his experience.
This video, for example. In this video about licks, I'm playing a tiny lick of an Eagles song, just one lick. I'm not playing the last note. And now this video is completely blocked for viewers in the United States, where coincidentally my biggest public is. And all the advertising money videos making from the rest of the world goes to them. Everything, not 1 cent for me. So for the 2-second lick, 8 little notes, in a freaking 15-minute long video, doesn't matter. The rest of the video doesn't matter.
Or even my friend Aaron Swartz. So Aaron Swartz is an extraordinary genius who inspired many people in the context of the internet and in civil liberties. Aaron Swartz was the inventor of the protocol of RSS, or he worked with others to develop that. He was the architect behind Creative Commons. He was one of the founders of Reddit, designed the technical architecture for Reddit, all of this before he was 20. Aaron Swartz, 12 years ago, came to me and he said, "Why are you wasting your time on these issues of copyright and internet policy, so long as we have this corrupted government? What do you think you're ever going to get?" And I said, "Aaron, it's not my field." And he said, "What do you mean? It's not your field as an academic?" I said, "Yeah, it's not my field as an academic. I do internet policy and copyright." And he said, "Is it your field as a citizen?" And that conversation on December 29th, 2006 in Berlin with Aaron Swartz led me to give up the work I was doing on copyright and the internet. And I announced from that moment I was devoting my life to this fight. Actually, I said I would devote 10 years. It turned out to take longer than 10 years, but 10 years at least, but now it's my life to this fight to restore this democracy from this system of corruption. And I've written now 4 books again. The 4th is out next month. You should pre-order right now. But 4 books to try to help people see and to rally people to this fundamental reform first. But in 2008, even Aaron Swartz came to me and he said, why? Why do we need to do this? Because we're going to elect Barack Obama, and he's going to get us everything we need, and we won't have to fight for fundamental reform because he will make it happen. So I stand before you as Cassandra, who I think I've got some useful examples of my warnings actually being Cassandra-like, because remember, her warnings were true. She just couldn't get people to believe them. And here's the Cassandra warning. We must make them reformers, our politicians, our leaders, or we will lose the capacity to govern. Not just on the issues we all talk about like climate change or healthcare or infrastructure or economic growth, but also on the issues we should be talking about: AI's increasing prevalence in our society, surveillance in everything that we do, the future of work, robot overlords that will be taking over every corner of our economy. These too we need a capacity to talk about, but to talk about them in a meaningful way, we need a sensible government. Sensible government is not optional in the 21st century. But let me make a little kind of Hollywood Cassandra mix here. Because I do think, in the end, this is an optimistic story. I do think we can do this. This election is the first time in 12 years I think there's a real shot to making fundamental reform happen. We can push candidates who will unify America around this issue rather than divide us on this issue. We need to get them to reform, and if we do that, and I agree it's a big if, but it's an important if we can get them to commit to a POTUS 1 platform, then I think it is possible. For the first time, I think it is possible. It is possible we will win, which means democracy wins, which means sensible governance would be possible again. It's not easy, it's not even clear. But just recognize it is 10 times more likely today than it was 4 years ago. And if we can win in this one fight, it is possible. It is possible, and it's just necessary if we're to have what we promised our children we would give them. Okay, one more thought here. So, on April 2nd, 2008, which my computer tells me is 4,202 days ago, Barack Obama gave a speech in Philadelphia before the AFL-CIO, telling us we had to take up that fight. Here's what he said: if we're not willing to take up that fight, the fight to change the way Washington works, then real change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. Take up that fight. Barack Obama was a friend of mine when we taught at Chicago. I think he was a great president, but he never took up that fight. Never after he beat Clinton in the primary did he even mention the fight. And never in 8 years in office did he even propose the changes that would begin to address this fundamental corruption of our democracy. He did not take up the fight. But what he said then was right then and is right now. If we don't take up that fight, then real change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. Now, when we think about taking up that fight, we should ask, for whom are we taking up that fight? You know, I'm a big brain sort of guy, so I would say, of course, it's for reason. It's logic that tells us we must take up this fight. But I'm also a weepy and sappy romantic. So I would say it's for love that we must take up this fight. It's for love of country. It's for love of our kids. Because who loses because we can't govern? We are obviously and persistently wrecking our climate, and that won't change until we fix our democracy. But who pays for this destruction? It's not us. We will be long gone. It is them who pay. It has been literally 20 years since Columbine. 20 years. And massacre after massacre. And we still can't muster the political courage to pass legislation to protect our kids. They pay the price directly. As we watch our debt balloon, our literally borrowing money from our kids, money we will never pay back, before they have to pay it back. The burden of that debt is felt by them, not us. As a healthcare system spirals out of control with costs unbelievable in the comparable world markets because of policy gifts that our government gives to pharmaceutical companies and insurance costs that are much too high and deliver much too little for us, it is not just us, it is especially them who will pay that price. Every single problem that we talk about is a problem that is a problem for them. We can't govern, and they pay the price. We've put this on them. Tom Brokaw wrote about my grandfather's generation, the greatest generation. Are we the worst generation? They sacrificed for us. What have we sacrificed for them? Now, there's no reason we must be that generation. We can inspire the politicians then. We can inspire them. Politics is about inspiring, and usually it's about them inspiring us. The John Kennedys, with their magic words, inspiring us to stand up for the nation. Now it's our turn. This time, it's us who must inspire them. This time, it's us who must say to them, you have to take up this fight. Because if you don't take up this fight, then real change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of our children, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure.